Thank you very much indeed. It's just a huge pleasure to be back in Ireland, which has played such a massively important role in Christianity in the past, and I have every faith and confidence it's going to do that again in the future. I think also a particular pleasure to be here in Maynooth. It's got such a peaceful, friendly, wonderful atmosphere, and it's an absolute delight to be here. So whatever the future of Christian thought, it has to involve returning good for evil. So my response to David Bentley Hart choosing out of three possible papers the one that would annoy me, or might annoy me, is to offer a paper that surely he's going to like. As you know, I've recently been in Provence, so if this paper has a kind of rather offbeat troubadour flavour to it, you've got to blame that. The world today is in turmoil, united only by a decadent version of Western culture, which is the domination of all life by objectification and subjective valorization. Older and more spiritually integrated cultures struggle against this in order to reassert themselves, but often in the mode of what are also decadent echoes of their own deep pasts, reduced for that reason to a merely modern assertion of raw power and identity. Appeals to global unity are framed in terms of the Western mode of decadence, calls for us to abide by a formal rules-based order, indifferent to ends but alert to every preference, every fragmented assertion of desire and complaint. It is in these terms that we are supposed to be respectful of the cultural other, and especially the non-Western other. But the overriding irony is that such a pluralism of value and unity of supposedly brute fact is an entirely Western outcome, much at variance with the natural integralism of most human cultures, generally bound together by a religious representation of ultimate reality. The more the West were to insist instead upon its older roots, the more it might be able to resonate with the other in a different and perhaps more deeply sympathetic way. Currently, global unity is conceived in starkly univocal terms, and cultural difference is seen as arbitrary and equivocal, with, in consequence, a mounting conflict between the abstract anywhere and the defended somewhere in multiple guises. But were the West to rediscover its own more integrated aspect, might a more tempered mode of conflict arise, allied to a more realistic prospect of co-living and tolerance, founded upon the always open analogical resonance between cultures and civilizations. To suggest this is not to seek to deny the advantages that have accrued from the separation of spheres and expertises in the Western past, nor of the prizing of the uniqueness of the individual and the desacralization of power, which is allied to an increased sense of contingency, mutability, pragmatism and experiment in working out the best political and social arrangements. But it is to suggest that this process has lost sight of its integrating spiritual vision, which eventually became a Christian one. Without this vision, what dominates is covertly a distorted version of this same Christian vision. From Pythagoras and Socrates onwards, the West refused mere monism pure physicalism and pure atomism. It chose to understand reality as articulated and articulable by embodied intelligence, as answerable to questions, construable by grammar, and modally alterable in logically traceable ways. Yet, if the real was perceived as rational, it was also found, first of all by Pythagoras, to contain irrational gaps of mathematical and ontological incommensurability, spaces only traversable by another internal, mystical, spiritual reality with its esprit de finesse that has already been invoked this evening. And surely Pascal was, in a sense, Pythagoras' heir. So for the Greeks, embodied things were real, but irreducible intelligence was also real, and their shared mediating ground of soul was real, soul which shapes life and propels motion. In a certain sense, the person was already present. Relation was already central. And just for this reason, the city was already conceived as being at once a naturally sacred destiny and a voluntary project. The community of souls, of rational animals. The merging of this classical outlook with the biblical one intensified these features. The absolute itself comes to be more emphatically viewed as the subjectively judged interplay of the one with the many. Matter as mere matter so nearly vanishes as to become entirely transparent to the workings of the Logos, as with the Cappadocian Fathers. Equivalently, the divine Logos so transcends the realm of finite existences that it can be envisaged either as beyond being or as pure to be, fully opening to view for the first time the ontological difference between beings and being as such. The absolute reason that now so completely emanates or specifically or sacrificially gives itself as to bring things about in the first place is also an absolute will whose own eternal thinking is a kind of bringing itself about, though without any normal ontic reflexivity that would render it a real causa sui. A reasoning that is also in God generation or eventuating. In extension of Plotinus, the absolute is now seen, for example, in Marius Victorinus and then in Maximus, to be as much in motion as it is in rest, since beyond Aristotle, who disintegrated motion into indefinitely minute moments of activity and potential, kinetic transition is now accorded full ontological dignity and is regarded as intensified, not inhibited by thought. These being points that even the great Aquinas had later lost sight of. Motion is, in a sense, already spirit, and spiritual reflection is, in a one dimension, an infinitely rapid motion or duration, the specifically Plotinian insight that Henri Bergson recovered by reading the Aeneas. Divine creation and eternal generation can even come to coincide, and in fact have come to coincide within the unfolding of creation in historical time. The Bible records for us the arrival of truth itself upon earth as apocalyptic disclosure of a truth that is in itself an infinite event and a future advent, as well as being a current performance. In consequence, truth now is seen to be additionally a finite event or a deed, and it is the deed of a subject who is wholly identified with this truth. Truth is objectively done or made, but it is also subjective, somehow both at once. The integration of the West depends upon keeping these two facets of the gospel together and linking them to a reinscribed, not abandoned metaphysical vision that is present in more narrative and symbolic modes in the Hellenistic writings of Judaism, and yet kindred to the conceptual vision of the Greeks. Created reality symbolically participates in the absolute. Apocalyptic or revelatory disclosures of this absolute are further manifestations of eternal truth, eternal divine creativity, eternal generation, self-relation, and response, conjuring the divine theurgically to bear upon the present in ritual performances, but both promising and enticing also its further arrival in future unspecified moments, threatening human cultural structures with both destruction and renewal, besides an ultimate arrival at the end of time when the division between the outer and the forecourts of God will be mysteriously blurred. Eventually, as we know too well, this integration, despite the allowance of difference, comes undone. The vision of eternal gnosis and its mediation is lost, and in consequence, the two facets of gospel truth are prized apart from each other, coming now to be in tension, though also in reinforcing mutual collusion. Truth is, on the one hand, a concrete and publicly ascertainable construct. On the other hand, it is mere personal preference. It is, on the one hand, science to be revered, and on the other hand, fashion to be enjoyed. As the now overlooked Michael Foster and the slightly less overlooked R.G. Collingwood, both often invoked by Donald McKinnon, by the way, argued in the 1930s, Christian doctrine of the Trinity and of the Incarnation remains the ultimate metaphysical presupposition of the West, but it has become fragmented and self-forgetting rather than no longer believed in, as if that were so crudely possible. We can't really leave these ultimate presuppositions behind, was part of Collingwood's argument. Thus, the Platonic anticipations of the Trinity persist. The West, and now the world, still seeks to link scientifically unity with plurality and to find pattern in motion. The gospel radicalization of the Platonic Trinity still persists. Science still seeks both to realize and to confirm truth in outcome. Yet it is now too rarely allowed that more subjective and emotional performances can also be newly arriving quasi-apocalyptic disclosures that at once improve the finite teleologically, open to view more of the eternal, and give us some hope of future, unknown transfiguration. In consequence, the arts, with many giant exceptions, like the wonderful English composer of modernist musical mysteries who has just died, Sir Harrison Birtwistle. With many exceptions, art has increasingly descended into diversion and trivia. Conversely, we have allowed the entirely valid sphere of operational truth, which is science, perversely and overwhelmingly to determine our sense of what truth as such is taken to be. The Gospels open to view, completing the intimations of Neoplatonism. Well, that was still to come, but the direction of travel of Platonism, The idea that truth is inherently poetic because it is self-expressing and self-giving and self-sacrificial all at once, and that the moving and transformative can be fully meaningful. But today, poesis has been reduced to mere techne, and the surplus over the technical consigned to a problematic oscillation between the sheerly willful and the untraceably aleatory. The decadence of the West, then, I'm arguing, is literally the decadence of Christian doctrine. A coherent Christian discourse of the kind that prevailed up till the year 1200, and somewhat more problematically up to the year 1300, knew no real divisions between theology, philosophy, and history. Ancient philosophy had already been about the best way of life as well as the abiding truth, and it was already familiar with ideas of revelatory oracles, of faith and transformative grace, however heightened these may be by the New Testament vision, which is as much an exacerbation of Greek notions as it is of Hebraic tradition. Christian thought was for a long time mainly Christian philosophy, rethinking the Logos as the word of creation, of incarnation, and of the cross, rethinking truth as also subjective and temporal, as in the case of Augustine, rethinking knowledge as always dependent upon testimony and faith, rethinking the unity of God as inherently Trinitarian, rethinking God as also and eternally human in the case of Maximus and Erugena, who consummated patristic reflection in this respect. On the basis of this transformation, the entire ancient classification of reality underwent revision, typically but variously. Accidents were seen more as modal transformations of and participations in substance within the now more hierarchically integrated reality of creation. Universal genera were seen as pre-including their exemplifications. Individual exemplifications were inversely seen as fully containing the universals after the Adamic, Trinitarian, and Christological examples, as Eric Erisman and John Marenbon have successfully shown. Extending the Neoplatonic critique of Aristotle, hypostases, or processes of determination that are also determined outcomes, were added to categorical classification, resulting in the Trinitarian and Christological sense of personhood as peculiarly monadic, as being unique and irreplaceable perspectival tropes or character, and yet also as being substantial sites of universal and general inclusion. The Neoplatonic trumping of horizontal difference between substance and attribute by hierarchical degrees of being is accepted by Christianity, and yet a novel horizontality of hypostases themselves is now projected into the Godhead. And this horizontality is combined with a new vertical coincidence of opposites and a collapsing of the ontological difference while yet sustaining it through the force of a single hypostatic action itself in the case of the incarnation. This same sense that divine transcendence of the ontic paradoxically allows and even requires a coincidence with it via the non-competition of the incommensurability of the finite and the infinite, and yet their spiritual and ineffable coincidence in a kind of extreme extension of this fundamental Pythagorean legacy. The same phenomenon permits a new conception of the drastic transformability of matter in the case of resurrection and Eucharist. Besides a new sense only fully realized as late as Leibniz, that the bond that holds any reality together, both essentially and existentially, is both mysterious and of direct participatory divine derivation. Today, I think we need an engagement with the rigors of Buddhist skepticism here, because that can help us to see how this notion of the bond of substance also transgresses the law of non-contradiction. Any existing thing is at once within itself and outside itself, because it has a boundary. So any individual thing is an incomprehensible miracle that has crossed totally incommensurable gulfs of reality. This is exactly how Paweł Florensky understands the phenomenon of personhood. Throughout all this Christian philosophical revision, the ancient aporia of the one and the many, of being as non-generic, of substance as being at once concrete thing and essence, of the different meanings of substance at different hypostatic or modal levels, were transformed by the force of Christian belief and teaching. The ontological difference of being from beings was more foregrounded. The different roles of substance were equalized under the aegis of relationality and generative process. The coherence of being was understood to be ineffably analogical and apophatic in a set of rising degrees of real negations. In horizontal and temporal terms, the negative opening of the human upon uncertainty and unfulfillment was held to witness to the arrival of the gift of grace as an inherent part of the entire created order, whose only destiny as deriving from God must be to return to him, and yet without loss of his outgoing creative work. In this light, the addition of history to given reality is an essential addition, whose unfolding is nothing other than the story of the vertical circulation told with an apocalyptic unfolding of the secret that this is also a divine journey in the opposite direction, and a journey of divine human sorrow and triumph, given the subversion of reality by angelic powers and their human allies. It is clear that our current discourse of university theology has often little to do with any of this, but is based rather upon an incoherent segregation of history as providing supposed factual foundations, from philosophy as providing supposed rational and conceptual ones, and both from systematic theology as confusingly seeking to blend these two sources of authority. The whole machinery is set up in order to ensure that theology proper remains in a subordinate place in relation to history and philosophy, and is unable to re-envisage these in any drastic manner, even though that should be the core of a Christian vision. All it can do is put a gloss upon them or add a new and purely positive supernatural layer that will in reality be itself conceived in empiricist and rationalist terms. We still have not really escaped the legacy of neo-scholasticism. When this enterprise, this current theological enterprise, finally dies, as it shortly will in all probability, all one should say is good riddance. In our current academic era, all the ironies multiply. Much theology has largely been predetermined by its obeisance to dominant current philosophies. In the last century, these were overwhelmingly post-Kantian and anti-metaphysical. Yet now secular philosophy itself worries that Kant was too anti-realist, too anthropocentric in an ecological era, and too closed off from many developments in modern science and mathematics. His finitism, for example, makes Leibniz by far the more modern figure. Theology is consequently wrong-footed, and yet it should reflect that in reality, the two dominant modes of philosophy in recent times, the analytic and the phenomenological, both genealogically derive from Catholic late scholasticism. The pivotal figure here being, of course, Bernard Bolzano, and that both in the qualified wake of Descartes and Kant offer essentially conservative citadels of epistemological, logical, or phenomenal certainty in the face of a nature that seems dangerously subject to endless mutation and open unnervingly to endless transformations by human beings. They are essentially philosophies of passivity concerning either given facts and appearances or given operations of reason, and not philosophies as we need of life, feeling, relational connection, and creative process. And yet the curious truth is that it is exactly the reduction of reality to inertia, to the tout fait, as Bergson said, that encourages the sense that it is completely fixable and controllable, and that thinking is a matter of following algorithms for the sake of predictability and control. In this way, the Cartesian seizure, the anti-Renaissance seizure of the Baconian Christian sense that truth as charity is to do with producing an outcome, a sense that can be construed mystically, as it was by both Comenius in the 17th century or much later by Charles Sanders Peirce, ensures that this sense will be taken in a one-sided, scientistic and technologizing way. The further irony, then, is that Christian obeisance to current philosophy, as towards current social science, turns out to be merely an obeisance towards a distorted legacy of Christian thinking. By now, the genealogical details have been filled in by many scholars, drastically qualifying Heidegger's tracing of the rise of ontotheology. Where once metaphysics in a Neoplatonic trajectory concerned equally both God and being, it became first to be primarily about being, with God idolatrously reduced to an ontic item within that general field. Then about being as innately univocal, and so as clear and distinct. And then about the clear and the distinct alone, which is obviously more to do with our knowledge of being than with being as such. In this way, what we today think of as metaphysics, which is primarily ontology with a reserved possibility of the undertaking of natural theology, was always only ever a grey ontology, in Jean-Luc Marion's memorable phrase. It was always, at least from Suarez onwards, already of itself half critically overturned into epistemology, with a resulting theoretical skepticism in consequence about the existence of God, real things, the soul, and the self. It was already primarily about the knowledge of objects. So we now know that Kant never entertained anything like what we find in Aquinas, and that his conclusions, far from precisely marking a revolutionary new critical epoch as they were taken to be, were in one sense only a more drastic sustaining of a Baroque conservatism in the face of the threat of the Renaissance with its pantheistic and Promethean dangers. And yet, at the same time, and most notably with Nicholas of Cusa, who I still think is the most important Christian past thinker for the future, a certain promise to extend the patristic and Boethian tradition in terms of a new metaphysics of participated creativity in the case of both nature and humanity. This would have been a real Western modernity, whereas the modernity we actually have is a sort of reactionary resistance born of heresy. I'm not the reactionary, my critics are. Of course, an alternative and more radical modernity has always lurked in the shape of Spinoza, yet his thought also is marked by neo-scholastic rationalism, and just for this reason is unable to think analogy and relational tension. Instead, by following Suarez and erecting modal variations into real differences, it is forced either to think of the one divine substance as cancelled out in the modes that express him, or of those modes as concealing his monistic reality. This is in effect a license for ceaseless transhuman and nihilistic reconfiguration of the real. The genius of Johann Heinrich Jacobi realized the hidden similarity between the Kantian and the Spinozan twists upon the neo-scholastic legacy. In either case, we face a shuttle between two nothings, as Connor Cunningham put it in his first book. A shuttle between appearances which are untrue and noumena which are inaccessible in the former case, between modes which are full but secondary, and substance which is empty but primary in the latter. Jacobi was, of course, an amateur and a journalist, but that's significant. For while on the whole theologians have slavishly tried to accommodate themselves to supposedly neutral secular philosophies that are just twisted and contorted Christian reflection, a whole cavalcade of outsiders to academic theology and sometimes academic philosophy have instead continued to realize that the potential of reason in the West is only the potential of Christian reason, even if you happen to be an atheist. Thus, Jacobi himself suggested that all reason relies upon a kind of religious faith and trust in reality. Hegel and Schelling developed further, in a however debatable a fashion, the implications of the Trinity for logic and metaphysics, with Peirce later taking this up in Schelling's wake and in perhaps a more orthodox fashion. Kierkegaard took much further the thought that truth is subjective and that Christ redefined philosophy as existential and truth as performance and event. Maine de Biron realized that the Christian focus upon the incarnation of mind in body points to the truth that the body and corporeal feeling, in the wake of the real Scottish Hume, not the English parody of this, old alliance thinker, is a zone that transcends the contrast of inner and outer, rendering metaphysics as epistemology impossible. Both Biron and later Félix Ravesson argued that only the reality of grace makes sense of the natural and primordial dominance of habits, even though habit would seem to be something that comes to be impossibly before itself, and therefore is in a sense a miracle of grace, a miracle of the divine gift and the divine self-donation that establishes these regularities. Maurice Blondel argued that thought and action also of themselves call for grace because they are constitutively incomplete. Rosmini, Bulgakov, and Simon Weil all suggested that only a Trinitarian ontology makes sense of our relational oscillation between the world as containing me and me as containing the world, or else between the open eye of each subject or substance and the objective modal propositionality that alone defines its identity, with the existential and copulative synthesis in either case being creative ethical action that is teleologically disclosive as well as reconciling. In other words, while theology, by failing to be also philosophy and history, was rendering itself irrelevant, various noble mavericks continued to sustain something like the abandoned Renaissance enterprise of developing a metaphysics of creative participation or of expressive self-sacrifice in the divine creation and in the inner divine Trinity, thereby adding a historically aware horizontal dimension to what was already the vertical perspective of Erugena, who had distinguished hypostatic levels of nature according to their relationship to the creative process specifically. And indeed, as time passes, it's always the names of these mavericks, heterodox or orthodox, who survive and whose books are read, not those of academic functionaries. In the 20th century, the Biranian legacy in particular, for which the cogito opens directly upon being in general, rather than corralling a substantive thinking substance within narcissistic representation, gave rise to the Christian philosophies of Weil, of Blondel, of Marcel, and even Bergson, whose superficially differing outlooks have now been shown by the remarkable work of Emmanuel Gabellieri to share a great deal in common, and which possesses affinities both with Russian sophiology and Anglo-Saxon attempts to mediate between empiricism and German idealism, in the case of Green, Bradley, Peirce, Whitehead, and Collingwood. A convergence, then, upon a philosophy of mediation and creativity, and consequently upon a Trinitarian and Christological ontology, is detectable in each one of these lineages. Furthermore, what we now see, thanks in part again to the work of Gabellieri, of Andrea Ballantoni, of William Desmond, and many others, is that in fact the purportedly anti-metaphysical stance of modern philosophy, both analytic and continental, was itself one continued outcome of metaphysics as understood ever since Henry of Ghent and Duns Scotus. For this philosophy is still metaphysics reduced to ontology, and so inevitably become epistemology, but now modified in order to look more objective by focusing exclusively upon the newly discovered modes either of appearances or of logical linguistic quantification, deemed indifferent at once to normal robust reality and to merely psychological subjectivity. Much, it should be said, and I want to underline this, has thereby been valuably discovered by modern philosophy. I don't want to totally trash it. But no modes of being are exclusive. Appearances are always linguistically structured, and linguistic structures always show something in excess of themselves. Within this interplay, we are, after all, ineluctably forced to speculate in an ontological mode about the hidden consistencies that lurk behind the manifest, as Husserl was highly aware, even if he in effect tried to suppress that. And so in speculating, we cannot divide our theorizing from what we decide to do in practice. We read what shows itself as disclosive signs, and we interpret by acting just as we act by interpreting. In so doing, we commit our bodies and our futures to our faithful and integral conjectures, which are not kind of abstract speculations, but emotionally committed and existential performances. In other words, because our lives and thoughts still take a Trinitarian and incarnational shape, we still act like Christians. We don't take enough thought. God himself designed it in time. How would we ever escape that? We never do. Perhaps the success of what is literally Christian natural science has revealed to the world Christian truth, but if so, only in a perverse way, only one-sidedly, by reducing everything to represented and controlled objects. Beyond the proof that the philosophy of success succeeds, we need to unleash the wider Christian philosophy of benign beautiful, and interpersonal theurgic arrivals under grace. In doing so, we need to abolish theology and recover a blending of theology, philosophy, and history, as Collingwood suggested long ago. What characterizes such an enterprise above all is an awareness that Christianity, despite its mediated dualism in continuity with the Greek legacy, does not compromise thereby a shared Eurasian monism, nor a shared Near-Oriental monotheism. I'm opening out to other religions here. In contrast to Spinoza's lurking dualism of the whole substance over the modes which inevitably deceive us, Neoplatonic or Vedantic emanation is the most monistic that one can get. In a sense, it already confronted our historicist and metaphilosophical anxieties, which we cannot now avoid. Is not any philosophical system an arbitrary decision as to what determines and what is determined? Spirit or matter, for example. Is it not also an arbitrary decision as to which mode to privilege? The object, the senses, thought, the phenomena, the imagination, language, mathematics, actuality or potentiality, and so forth. But an emanative philosophy allows that there is but one flow of and from the one, and that even the ordered descending hypostases are, from another point of view, equally valid modal perspective. Indeed, that even the one itself both is and is not such a perspective. We need indeed a philosophy of the middle or of the mixes, as Connor Cunningham is putting it in his latest work. I'm very sorry he's not there. Here. None of that, then, is denied. None of this real monism is denied by Christianity, which in fact builds upon such a meta perspective. Nor does Christianity deny the unity and simplicity of God. The Trinity and the Incarnation should be read as a more radical assertion of just that. To the contrary, the suspicion of idols in the Old Testament is the suspicion of gods, not as to their reality, but as to their ultimacy and cultic subversion of our attention. It is just for this reason that these scriptures possess already a latently Gnostic bent, which in time increases the suspicion that lesser gods or angels or demons have interfered with created reality. For the Book of Enoch, that includes precisely the suspicion that human technology derives from secrets that dubious angels, like the Titan Prometheus, should never have let us in upon. The New Testament is the record of the inbreaking of a secret deeper than the knowledge of such control already promised by Enoch, Jubilees, and other kindred writings. The truth that self-sacrificial submission in love is more powerful than power, the real ultimate public gnosis, as Rowan was stressing. But it belongs to this ultimate apocalypse, which comprises the whole of the Gospels, that we should not idolize even the one. The true one is also many, is only established in unity by repeating himself without going outside himself, and as becoming aware of this. Similarly, the true one, being such innate generosity, also does go outside himself, even into the limit by limiting himself, and yet, of course, this he cannot seemingly do, being already omnipresent. And therefore, he must, at some mysterious point, coincide also with the extra of limitation, scarcity, and rarity, which now takes on an unexpected value as such. Thus, if the creation was already pre-thought in the Logos, it was also pre-thought in a Son of God who is equally a Son of Man, in a mediating figure who, like Sophia, his mother, was already there with God, who has now arrived and yet remains the one to come. Were it not that God is also man, there could be no redemption, because otherwise to refuse God is simply, I nearly finished, it won't be long, is simply to exit reality. But read with objectivity, the New Testament again and again suggests that the incarnation is as much or more a matter of the revealing of a hidden celestial truth than it is the narrative report of the realization of this truth for the sake of our salvation. How could it be otherwise? God, who is God, does not lack anything in himself, not even free generosity that extends beyond himself. It is madness to think that he adds generosity to himself by a decision to create that he might not have taken. A true humility instead realizes that creation shows God to be innately creative, just as he is innately relational. Only outside himself in either case, because more fundamentally within himself. Christianity, therefore, in its very particularity, is a thinking of the perennial and the universal, common to all of Eurasia and perhaps to the entire globe. If we can recover a measured Christian integralism of thought and practice, in the wake of so many esotericists who turn out merely to have been authentically orthodox, then maybe we will be able to communicate better with other cultural legacies and offer them something more than debased Christianity as scientism. From our fellow ancient non-Western Christians in Africa and the Near East, perhaps we need to learn things, attend to the implications of their much larger biblical canon, which includes many more intertestamental apocalyptic texts, and so tends to favor a stronger sense of Christ-fused unity, albeit in perhaps unsatisfactory ways. From further east, we need to relearn a certain monism, while not falling into the caricatures of the East as totally adverse to the recognition of finite stability and individual interruption, which have often been proposed by Westerners anxious to fantasize an alternative to Christianity in the Far East from Schopenhauer onwards. Yet the balance between unity, essence, and personhood suggested by the central Christian doctrines and the implication of the idea that beyond even the essential Trinitarian of unity of God lies the personal Christological unity that binds creator and creation together in one consistent but open character and style, remains surely suggestive of a universal revision of our sense of the universal. Neither unity nor individuality are ultimate. Relationality and shared idiom matters just as much, but without abolishing either unity or the individual. It is so obviously a matter of politics as much as of philosophy. It's a matter of both linking, and as Rowan Williams says, addition, of adding in order to link and to envisage linking. A sense that metaphysics as seeking linkage also adds, that politics as seeking to add also adds linkages and discovers them. This is exactly Blondell's revisioning of metaphysics. How to get there? One simple final suggestion, and I really will end. The more it seems that we turn against Christianity, the more secular philosophers write books discovering just how Christian we are. They write books about the Bible much more discerning than those written by believers or by biblical critics. Does this not suggest that we need to break with our primordial Christian practice in the West, however humanistically admirable, of first training children in the classical and supposedly secular myths and truths, and only offering the Bible and the Christian legacy in a Sunday compartment or later to a selected few? Would it not be better here to copy other, more integrated religious cultures and from the very outset offer children in an open and non-didactic way the Hebraic and Christian as well as classical sources of our civilizational legacy? One way or another, our response as Christians to the crisis of our times should be the demand to people in the West, whether they think they believe or not, that they reconsider the ineluctable character of the Western Christian identity. The first question to be posed is whether they are the unwitting victims of a long deformation and obfuscation of that identity, often by Christians themselves, which the West has now imposed on everyone else. The next question is whether we can today recover and repeat differently that legacy. Thank you.